So in the last section, I mentioned various ways of kind of questioning canonicity in general, and I pointed towards Toni Morrison. And more recently as well, this idea that the canon itself is something that ought to be open to question was articulated by Bernadine Evaristo in the introduction to the series of books that she prefaced under the label Black Britain Writing Back, published by Penguin. Now, in one sense, that project looks like it's a kind of expansion of the canon. It makes available again in paperback a number of books by Black British writers that had fallen into obscurity and hadn't, according to Evaristo, received the kind of acknowledgement that they deserved. And so in one sense, it looks like a kind of expansion of the canon. But as I say, Evaristo is very careful to say that what she's not doing is setting up, as it were, a canon of Black British writing, or indeed simply seeking to expand the canon, because the canon itself is something that she wants to question. Now, why might one want to do that? Well, first of all, I pointed in the last section as well to kind of deeper social, political reasons for wanting to wonder whether a simple kind of expansion of representation is, as it were, the cure. John Guillory, who wrote a marvellous book called Cultural Capital in the early 1990s, who, like me, had considerable sympathy with the liberal critique of the canon and thought that it had a great many very positive outcomes, the expansion of and revision of the curriculum, nevertheless thought that it should go further, first by acknowledging that the absence of certain writers from certain social groups in earlier historical periods was not a result of a conspiracy to exclude them, but rather the result of much deeper social, political exclusions from access to education as such. Thomas Gray, in his very celebrated Elegy in a Country Churchyard, talks about mute, inglorious Miltons who may rest in their graves in the country churchyard. And what he's putting his finger on there is the fact that people, working class people, rural populations, for instance, simply did not have access to the kind of education that Milton, who was not mute, who did write, who was glorious, did have access to. And so the question then here is a fundamental question of the distribution of educational and literary goods, which in the past were not widely distributed. And so there's a question here of a much broader democratization of education and of greater access to education, rather than simply a question of expanding the canon or of erecting canons or constituted by writers from particular social groups. There are questions then of social and political exclusion in that regard. The idea of cultural capital then is the idea of access to education, the means of knowledge, and so on. What Guillory also wants to do is to suggest then that questions of literary value and of literary judgment ought to be separated out from questions of canon formation. What he argues is that the judgment that a particular work is great is not sufficient for something to become canonical. It's necessary, so on the one hand we have to judge certain works, or certain works have to be judged to be great in order for them to become canonical, but that is not by itself enough. That judgment has to take place within an institutional setting. It has to be shared. It has to take place within the setting of an institution that is capable of reproducing and perpetuating that judgment and those works. Those institutions are schools and universities. It is no accident then that Palgrave was a minister, not a minister, but sorry, a civil servant in the Ministry of Education. Matthew Arnold was an inspector of schools, and he gave his lecture in which he announced Shakespeare and Milton as the classics of English literature during his tenure of the Oxford Professorship of Poetry, so in a university. These institutions and their reproduction of certain works by teaching them year after year, by putting them on syllabuses, that is how canons are formed, in addition to individual judgments of the greatness of particular works. So in one sense then, it is not simply the case that individual works and their greatness is enough to get them into the canon, because judgment, or that kind of judgment by specific individuals or groups of individuals, does not establish the canonicity of works, and also works that are or have been judged canonical, often not thought to be great, and also there is much disagreement within the canon itself as well. So first of all then, the solution Guillory proposes is that we should not homogenize the canon. It isn't really true to say that canonical works represent a singular political program. William Blake, for instance, is a revolutionary poet who could not be more different in many ways from the celebration of monarchy and empire that one meets with in, for instance, the writing of John Dryden. There is not a kind of homogeneity to the canon in that regard. But also what we need to do then is to turn our attention to questions of access to education, to think about what it is that we're doing when we're teaching literature as such. So rather than just adding more and more works, which we should certainly do to our teaching of literature, ask what it is that we're doing by teaching them. What questions is it that we're asking when we're being asked to make judgments about literary works? What does it enable us to do? What kinds of debate and discussion does it give us access to by thinking about works of literature, by honing our skills of judgment? So in that sense, those questions are separable from the kinds of works that are themselves judged as well. So in summary then, the critique of the maleness and whiteness of the canon is extraordinarily valuable and has had some remarkable successes and needs to have more. But the questions of how the canon itself comes to be formed are in some ways more fundamental and need to be more fundamentally addressed by thinking about what it is that we're doing by teaching literature, by who has access to how the canon itself is determined, and so on. Adding more works to the canon, yes, but then thinking more about the canon and democratizing education itself more fluidly so that we have a canon that is in process of reformation by many more participants in educational institutions is the end and aim that we think that I think that we should aim for, that Guillory announced in the early 1990s and still has a lot of work to be done with respect to it. Thank you very much.